The acrid smell of death hung heavy in the air as vultures circled overhead, their shadows dancing across the cracked earth like harbingers of doom. In the distance, the skeletal remains of what once was a thriving watering hole lay exposed under the merciless sun. The drought had been merciless, 6 moons without rain, 6 moons of watching the land slowly die. And now she had to choose. Kala, a female Homo habilis and leader of the Red Rock tribe, stood at the edge of the cliff, her weathered hands trembling as she held the sacred bone that would decide the fate of her people. Below her, 23 souls looked up with hollow eyes, their children's cries echoing through the canyon like the wails of the damned. The strong could journey to the distant mountains where rumors spoke of water. The weak would remain behind to face certain death, but among the weak was her own blood. The morning sun cast long, twisted shadows across the desolate landscape as Kala descended from her rocky perch. Her bare feet, hardened by countless seasons of walking across unforgiving terrain, made no sound against the sun-baked earth. The silence that greeted her was more terrifying than any predator's roar. It was the silence of a world dying. "Gather the circle," she commanded, her voice cutting through the stillness like a stone blade. The tribe emerged from the shallow caves they called home, their movements slow and deliberate, conserving what little energy remained in their malnourished bodies. Kala watched as they formed the sacred circle, noting how the strong naturally separated from the weak, how mothers clutched their children closer, how the elders' eyes already held the resignation of the doomed. Maku, her eldest son and the tribe's fiercest hunter, stepped forward. His once powerful frame had been reduced to sinew and bone, but his eyes still burned with the fire of survival. "Mother," he whispered, using the ancient word that carried both respect and desperation. "The scouts have returned from the north. The scouts, 2 young males who had risked everything for a glimpse of hope, knelt before Kala. Their bodies told the story before their words could. Cracked lips, sunken cheeks, and skin burnt raw by the relentless sun. "Speak," Kala commanded. "Water," gasped Jaru, the younger of the 2. 7 days' walk through the death valleys, maybe 8. The mountains, they still weep. A collective exhale rippled through the circle, part relief, part terror. 7 days through terrain that had already claimed 3 of their best hunters. 7 days with children who could barely walk one. Kala felt the weight of every gaze upon her. She had led them through countless hardships. The great fire that consumed half the forest, the winter when the mammoth herds vanished, the plague that took her mate and firstborn daughter. But this this was different. How many can make the journey? She asked Maku, though she already knew the answer would tear her heart in 2. Maku's jaw tightened. 12. Maybe 15 if we carry the young ones in shifts. And the others? Silence. The kind of silence that screams louder than any storm. Old Mira, the tribe's memory keeper, shuffled forward. Her blind eyes seemed to see more than anyone's. In the time of the great dying, when our ancestors faced the same choice, they honored the old ways. The strong survived to continue the bloodline. The weak find peace in the eternal hunt. Kyla's hand moved instinctively to her side, where her youngest child, barely 3 seasons old, clung to her leg. Little Zara had been born during the last good season, when the rivers ran full and the herds were plentiful. Now, fever racked her tiny body, and her breathing came in short, painful gasps. The choice crystallized before Kala like ice forming over a winter lake. Take the strong and leave the weak to die slowly, or risk everyone and watch them all perish in the wasteland. But as she looked down at Zara's fevered face, another possibility whispered in her mind, one that the ancestors had never considered, one that would either damn them all or forge a new legend. The bone in her hand grew heavier as the sun climbed higher, and somewhere in the distance, a hyena laughed. The decision ceremonies of the Red Rock tribe had always been sacred affairs. conducted under the watchful gaze of the ancestor spirits when the moon was full. But there was no time for tradition now, only the brutal mathematics of survival. Kala raised the sacred bone above her head. Carved from the femur of a great lion that her grandfather had slain, it bore the markings of every critical decision the tribe had ever made. Today, it would bear the weight of their extinction or salvation. "The spirits will guide us," she declared, her voice carrying across the canyon walls and echoing back like a ghostly chorus. "But first, we must face the truth of our choosing." She began to walk the circle, stopping before each member of the tribe. Her eyes, once warm with maternal affection, now held the cold calculation of a predator assessing prey. The strong ones, Maku and his hunting band, 3 younger mothers with healthy children, the scouts who had survived the northern journey, she marked with ochre on their foreheads. Then came the others. Keja, whose leg had been crushed by a falling boulder and never healed properly, looked up at Kala with understanding in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I've known since the rain stopped." Tane, once the tribe's greatest storyteller, now too weak to even lift his head, simply nodded as Kala's hand passed over him. But when she reached old Var, the woman who had helped birth every child in the tribe, something inside Kala cracked. Vara's weathered hands had guided Zara into this world, had sung the ancient songs that eased the pain of childbirth, had been a second mother to them all. "I cannot," Kala whispered, her composure finally breaking. Vara reached up with surprising strength and grasped Kala's wrist. "You must. The tribe is more than its parts. Some seeds must die for others to grow." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Kala completed her terrible inventory. 15 marked for survival, 8 condemned to die. And in her arms, little Zara burned with fever, her tiny body caught between life and death, between the marked and the unmarked. Maku approached his mother as the circle dispersed to prepare for departure. "The child," he said simply, not meeting her eyes. "She won't survive the journey." Kala's grip on Zara tightened. "She's your sister. She's already dying, mother. Would you doom us all for one who may not see another sunrise?" The words hit Kala like physical blows. She had watched 3 of her children die already taken by disease, accident, and the countless dangers of their world. Each death had carved a piece from her soul. But Zara ... Zara was her last chance at redemption, her final gift from the ancestors. That night, as the tribe made their preparations, Kala sat alone at the edge of their territory, cradling Zara against her chest. The child's breathing was labored, her skin hot to the touch. In the distance, she could see the cooking fires being extinguished, hear the soft murmur of final goodbyes. A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see Nira approaching, her staff tapping against the rocky ground. "You think there's another way?" the old woman said, settling beside her with a grunt of effort. "The caves," Kala whispered. "The deep places where our ancestors sheltered during the last great dying. There might be water there, underground springs that haven't dried up." Nira was quiet for a long moment. "And if there isn't? Then we die together, as a tribe should. That's not leadership, child. That's sentiment." Kala felt tears she couldn't afford to shed burning behind her eyes. "Then teach me to be the leader they need." But Nira's answer was lost as a sound echoed across the canyon. The roar of something massive, something hungry, something that had caught the scent of their desperation. The night hunters had arrived. The roar that shattered the night silence was one that every member of the Red Rock tribe knew with primal terror. Shadowmaw, the great cave bear that had stalked their territory for 3 seasons. Standing twice the height of a man when reared up on his hind legs, with claws that could tear through stone and a hunger that seemed as endless as the drought itself. Kala leaped to her feet, Zara still clutched against her chest, as chaos erupted throughout the camp. The massive silhouette of Shadowmaw appeared on the ridge above them, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of their fires like twin moons of malevolence. "Formation!" Maku's voice cut through the screams of terror. "Protect the young!" But even as the hunters scrambled for their weapons, crude spears tipped with obsidian, clubs carved from ironwood, Kala knew they were no match for Shadowmaw in their weakened state. The beast had grown bold with hunger, and the scent of their desperation had drawn him like blood draws flies. The great bear began his descent, each step sending small avalanches of rock cascading into the camp. His massive form moved with surprising grace, a predator honed by millions of years of evolution, now facing prey weakened by nature's own cruel selection. "The caves!" Kala screamed. "Everyone to the deep caves!" It was a desperate gamble. The cave system that honeycombed their territory was largely unexplored, a labyrinth of narrow passages and hidden chambers that their ancestors had whispered about, but never fully mapped. Some passages led to underground rivers, others to dead ends where bones of ancient creatures lay scattered like warnings. As Shadowmaw charged into the camp, his claws raking through their meager possessions like grass, the tribe scattered in every direction. Kala saw Keja, hobbling on her damaged leg, stumble and fall directly in the beast's path. Without thinking, she thrust Zara into Nira's arms and grabbed a burning branch from the fire. "Here!" she screamed, waving the flame. "Here, you monster!" Shadowmaw's massive head swung toward her, his nostrils flaring. For a moment that stretched like eternity, predator and prey stared at each other across the smoke-filled camp. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very mountains, he charged. Kala dove aside just as crushing paws thundered past her head. She rolled, came up running, and led the beast away from where most of the tribe was fleeing toward the cave entrance. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of pursuit, the heavy breathing, the scrape of claws on stone, the promise of death closing the distance with every heartbeat. The cave entrance yawned before her like the mouth of some primordial god. Without hesitation, she plunged into the darkness, her torch casting wild shadows on walls that seemed to pulse with ancient life. The familiar scent of their shelters gave way to something older, damper, the breath of the earth itself. Behind her, Shadowmaw's roar echoed through the passages, distorted by stone into something even more terrifying. The beast was too large for some of the narrower tunnels, but his rage drove him deeper into the maze, following the scent trail that Kala had unwittingly laid. As she ran deeper into the mountain's heart, Kala realized that her desperate gambit might have doomed them all. If Shadowmaw became trapped in the caves with them, there would be no escape. They would become a feast for the bear, served up by their own leader's panic. But then, as her torch began to flicker and die, she heard something that made her heart leap, the soft trickle of water over stone, the underground springs. They existed. Behind her, Shadowmaw's roars grew more distant, but no less threatening. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, she could hear the voices of her tribe, calling her name with a mixture of hope and terror that cut through her soul like a blade. She had saved them from the bear, and had she led them into an even darker tomb? The underground chamber that Kala stumbled into defied every expectation she had harbored about the depths beneath their territory. Her dying torch revealed a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to dance with ancient purpose. But it was the sound that truly amazed her, not just the trickle of water she had heard, but a symphony of flowing streams that echoed off the stone walls like the whispered secrets of the earth itself. "Mother!" Maku's voice echoed from somewhere in the darkness. "Where are you?" "Here," she called back, her voice bouncing off unseen walls. "Follow my voice." One by one, the surviving members of the tribe emerged from the various passages that fed into the central chamber. They came bearing the improvised torches they had managed to grab during their flight, bundles of dried grass wrapped around stones, burning cloth torn from their meager possessions. The flickering lights revealed something extraordinary. Water. Not just a small spring, but an entire underground river system that had been flowing beneath their feet all along. The streams carved channels through the living rock, creating pools of crystal-clear water that reflected their torchlight like captured stars. "The ancestors," whispered Nira, her blind eyes somehow seeing more than those with sight. "This is where they sheltered during the first great dying. Can you feel them? They're still here." As if summoned by her words, strange paintings began to emerge on the walls as more torches illuminated the space. Ancient hands had drawn the stories of their people, here hunters pursuing mammoth herds, families gathered around fires, and stranger things that made Kayla's skin crawl. Creatures that looked almost human, but wrong somehow, with elongated limbs and eyes that held too much intelligence. "Drink carefully," Kala instructed as the tribe gathered around the pools. "Small sips first. Our bodies aren't used to abundance." As her people tentatively cupped the life-giving water in their hands, Kala heard something that made her blood freeze, a low rumbling growl echoing from one of the tunnel entrances. Shadowmaw had found them, but the great bear's roar sounded different now. Frustrated, angry. The massive predator was too large for many of the passages, and the maze-like structure of the cave system was confusing even his keen senses. "He can't reach us easily," Maku observed, moving to stand beside his mother. "But he can wait." "Bears are patient hunters," Kala nodded grimly. They had water now, but no food except for the few dried provisions they had managed to grab during their flight. And outside, the drought continued its relentless assault on the land. Even if they survived Shadowmaw, they would eventually have to face the wasteland above. There, Tanae's weak voice drew their attention to a section of the cave wall where the ancient paintings seemed to tell a specific story. Despite his frailty, the old storyteller's eyes were sharp when it came to reading the wisdom of their ancestors. The paintings showed figures very much like themselves, trapped in a similar chamber. But the story didn't end in death instead. It showed them emerging from a different cave entirely, one that opened onto green lands beyond the mountains. "A passage," Kala breathed. "There's another way out." But as they studied the ancient artwork more closely, other details became apparent. Some of the figures in the paintings weren't emerging from the caves at all. They were being consumed by something that lurked in the deeper passages. Something with too many teeth and eyes that glowed in the painted darkness. Little Zara stirred in Nira's arms, her fever finally breaking as the cool cave air and fresh water began to work their healing magic. For the first time in days, Kala allowed herself to hope. Then the torches began to flicker, and from somewhere, deep in the earth beneath them, came a sound that was definitely not wind or water. Rhythmic scraping, as if something massive was dragging itself through the stone toward their sanctuary. The ancestors' paintings suddenly seemed less like historical records and more like warnings. And in the growing darkness, Kala realized that Shadowmaw might be the least of their problems. The scraping sound from the depths grew louder as the night wore on, a rhythmic grinding that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeats of the terrified tribe. Kala had ordered half their torches extinguished to conserve fuel, plunging sections of the cavern into an oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. "What do the paintings tell us about the deep thing?" she whispered to Tan, who had positioned himself close to the ancient artwork despite his weakened condition. The old storyteller's eyes moved slowly across the painted walls, translating symbols that had been old when his grandmother's grandmother was young. "The pale crawler," he whispered. "Born in the depths when the world was young. It feeds on life itself. Breath, warmth, the essence that separates the living from the stone." As if responding to his words, the scraping stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, even the sound of dripping water seemed thunderous. Then, from one of the lower passages they hadn't yet explored, came a new sound, a wet, sliding noise, like something massive and boneless moving through spaces too small for it. Maku gripped his spear tighter. though they all knew their crude weapons would be useless against something that had survived in these depths for untold eons. How do we fight it? You don't fight the pale crawler, Tan continued, his voice growing weaker. You appease it, the ancestors. They had to choose. Feed it the weak, or lose everyone to its hunger. The terrible mathematics of survival had followed them even into their sanctuary. Once again, Kala faced the choice between saving a few and sacrificing the rest. But now the stakes were even higher. Whatever lurked in the depths below wouldn't simply let them die peacefully. It would consume them slowly, draining their life force until they became empty husks. A pale luminescent glow began to emanate from the lower passage, growing stronger with each passing moment. The light had a sickly quality that made their skin look like corpses and turned the cave paintings into writhing nightmares. The other passage, Kala said suddenly, pointing to where the ancient artwork showed the survivors emerging into daylight. If the ancestors found a way out, so can we. But even as she spoke, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The painting showed clear evidence of sacrifice figures being left behind to face the pale crawler, while others escaped. The ancestors had been forced to make the same impossible choice she now faced. The luminescence from below grew brighter, and with it came a sound that made everyone's skin crawl a low, keening wail that seemed to bypass their ears and speak directly to the most primitive parts of their brains. It was the sound of hunger-given voice, of ancient appetite that had waited in darkness for fresh prey to stumble into its domain. Little Zara began to cry, her fever-weakened cries echoing off the chamber walls. The sound seemed to excite whatever was rising from the depths, and the pale glow pulsed more rapidly. "It's drawn to the young," Mira observed with terrible clarity. "The weak, the sick. Their life force burned brightest in its perception." Kala felt the familiar weight of leadership settling on her shoulders like a burial shroud. She could try to lead everyone through the escape passage, knowing that the pale crawler would follow and likely consume them all in the narrow confines. Or she could make the sacrifice the ancestors had made, leave the weakest behind to satisfy the creature's hunger while the strongest fled. But as she looked at her tribe, her people who had followed her through drought and disaster, who trusted her with their lives, a third option began to form in her mind. It was desperate, possibly suicidal, but it offered something the other choices didn't: the chance for everyone to survive. The pale glow was now clearly visible at the mouth of the lower passage, accompanied by the sound of something large squeezing itself through spaces that shouldn't accommodate its bulk. In moments, the pale crawler would emerge into their chamber, and the time for choosing would be over. Kala raised the sacred bone above her head one final time, but instead of marking the living and the dead, she made a different kind of choice entirely. "Everyone to the upper passage," she commanded. "Now, and whatever you hear behind us, don't look back." The escape passage that the ancient paintings had promised stretched before them like a throat leading toward either salvation or a more terrible doom. Unlike the spacious chamber they were leaving behind, this tunnel was narrow, forcing them to travel single file through passages that seemed to compress around them like the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. Kala led the way, her torch casting dancing shadows on walls that bore no ancient artwork, only the scars left by countless years of water erosion and something else: claw marks. Deep gouges in the stone that looked disturbingly fresh. Behind them, the sounds of their pursuit echoed through the narrow space. Not just the wet sliding of the pale crawler, but something worse. Shadowmaw had found his way into the cave system and was following their trail with the relentless patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. "The passage splits ahead," Maku called from behind her, his voice tight with strain from carrying one of the weaker children. Kala raised her torch higher, illuminating two branching paths. One angled upward toward what she hoped was the surface. The other descended deeper into the mountain's heart. The ascending path showed clear signs of ancient yews worn smooth by countless feet over generations. But it was also where the claw marks were deepest. The paintings, Tane gasped, struggling to keep pace despite his weakness. There was something else. The ancestors didn't all escape. Some of them ... chose to stay, to become guardians. Before Kala could ask what he meant, a new sound echoed from behind them. Not the scraping of the pale crawler or the heavy breathing of Shadowmaw, but something else entirely. Voices, human voices, but wrong somehow. Too deep, too resonant, as if they came from throats that had been changed by long years in the depths. Who goes there? The voice echoed from the darkness behind them, speaking in an ancient dialect that Kala could barely understand. Who disturbs the Guardian's vigil? Old Nira's face went white. The lost ones, she whispered. The ancestors who stayed behind. They're still here. From the shadows emerged figures that had once been human but were no longer entirely so. Their skin had taken on the pale, luminescent quality of cave-dwelling creatures, their eyes enlarged and adapted to eternal darkness. But they moved with intelligence, carried weapons, and wore the ritual scarifications that marked them as descendants of the original tribe. "You lead the living through our domain," their spokesman said, his enlarged eyes fixing on Kala with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "What tribute do you offer the Guardians?" Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The pale crawler's keening wail mixed with Shadowmaw's frustrated roars, creating a symphony of hunger and rage that was rapidly closing the distance. Kala understood now. The ancestors hadn't simply escaped, they had made a bargain. Some had fled to the surface world, while others had stayed behind to guard the passages, becoming something between human and cave dweller in the process. They had been feeding the pale crawler for generations, keeping it sated so it wouldn't follow escaping tribes to the surface. "I offer myself," Kala said, raising the sacred bone. "As tribute for safe passage, no." Maku lunged forward, but the pale guardians were faster, surrounding Kala with movements too fluid for purely human anatomy. "The leader's sacrifice is acceptable," the spokesman hissed. "But the deep hunger has grown strong. It will need more than one." That's when Kala played her final gambit, the desperate plan she had been forming since they first encountered the pale crawler. "Then let it have what it truly hungers for," she said, and threw her torch not forward into the escape passage, but backward toward their pursuers. The flame illuminated a sight that would haunt their dreams forever. Shadowmaw and the pale crawler, locked in mortal combat, the great bear's claws raking across something that was less flesh than living shadow, while the creature's own appendages sought purchase on fur and muscle. While they fight, Kala shouted to her people, "We run!" The Guardians, apparently as surprised by this turn of events as anyone, hesitated just long enough for the tribe to push past them into the ascending passage. Behind them, the sounds of the titanic battle echoed through the caverns, roars of pain and fury mixing with that terrible keening wail. The passage climbed steeply now, and Kala could feel a current of air that spoke of the surface world above. Fresh air, clean air, the promise of sky and stars in a land beyond the drought. When they finally emerged into daylight, it was to find themselves on the far side of the mountain range, looking down into a valley where green grass still grew and a river ran full and clear. The promised land that the ancient paintings had shown them. But as Kala turned to count her people, to ensure that everyone had made it through, she found herself looking into the hollow eyes of the Guardian spokesman, who had followed them to the surface. "The bargain is not complete," he said, his pale form seeming insubstantial in the bright sunlight. "The deep hunger is not satisfied. It will follow. It will find you. Unless ... double quotes. Unless what?" His smile revealed teeth that had adapted for a diet she didn't want to contemplate. "Unless someone stays behind. Someone returns to feed the hunger and keep it sated. The Guardians grow few, and new blood is needed." Kala looked at her people, her surviving tribe who trusted her completely, who had followed her through hell itself. Then she looked at little Zara, healthy now in the clean air, reaching toward the sunlight with tiny fingers. Some choices, she realized, could never be escaped. They could only be postponed. And in the depths below, something pale and hungry waited with eternal patience for the next tribe to lose their way in the dark. The drought was over. But the real test of leadership was just beginning.